think there's a persistent idea that serious art requires an indifference to some commerce. That is, I think, one of the most damaging myths that we have in independent film, because it keeps talented filmmakers broke. It keeps investors suspicious, and it keeps good projects from getting off the ground.
Hello and welcome to Off the Lot. The film industry is changing fast, and if you want to make movies, it's time to become your own gatekeeper. If you've got a vision and the drive to make it happen, this podcast is for you.
We're your hosts, Ken Kabatov and Anthony Epp, and every week we dive into the hustle, challenges, and strategies of independent filmmaking. We talk to directors, producers, and industry pros about what it really takes to get your film made on your own terms.
Let's dive in.
Okay, welcome back to Off the Lot. My name is Anthony Epp, and as you can probably tell this week, I am running this solo again. So Ken is in the middle right now of getting through his director's cut. We are going to have him back on very shortly, but he is just swamped right now with that. So I thought I would get on today and talk to you about a subject that all of us as independent filmmakers have to deal with. And before I do that, I want to tell you a little story. There was a meeting that happened in January of 1942. A guy named Jack Warner, one of the brothers of the Warner Brothers, who actually ran things, is sitting in his office in Burbank, California. And a story editor named Irene Diamond walks in with a play that she happened to find in New York. This is an unproduced play. Nobody had staged it yet. And it was called Everybody Comes to Rick's. She said, "We should buy this." Warner bought it for $20,000. Now, this is an unproduced play. That was, at the moment, the most anyone in Hollywood had ever paid for an unproduced play. Now, so they have this property. They need a script, and they hire the Epstein twins. Now, don't confuse them with the current Epstein story. This is a different set of twins. Julius and Philip are their names, and they are two of the best writers in the business. Now, almost immediately, the Epstein twins have to leave. Against Warner's wishes, they go to Washington to work on Frank Capra's Why We Fight documentary series. This is wartime, remember. So patriotism and, pro-war activity and movies and so on are the big thing of the day. And so they outrank the Epstein studio contract with Warner Brothers. So Warner Brothers pulls in another writer, and his name is Howard Koch. He gets to work. He writes about 30 to 40 pages, and then the Epsteins come back. And Warner reassigns them to the project because, of course, again, they're two of the best writers in the business, and Coach's pages are set aside. Now, there's a rush to get into filming on this project because, again, this is patriotism time. This is World War II. This movie happens to take place during World War II. So they're trying to get movies out the door that are going to promote America's involvement in the war. So they start filming on May 25th, 1942 with, and I want you to hear this, only half of the script completed. They go over budget, $75,000 over in 1942. So the whole production costs just over $1 million, which at that time was some serious money. Now, the ending nobody can agree on. Ingrid Bergman famously has no idea which man her character is actually in love with because nobody will tell her. The director tells her to just play it in between. So she gets direction mid-shoot to play ambiguity because, quite frankly, the writers still are figuring this out. And the last line of the film, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. That line was written by producer Hal Wallace 3 weeks after they wrapped. Bogart had to come back into the studio just to dub it in. Then, and this is my favorite part, the Allies invade North Africa in November of 1942. They take Casablanca. It's in every newspaper, it's all over the radio, and Warner Brothers looks at their shelf and realizes, we have this movie called Casablanca. And they rush it into one theater in New York, just one, to ride the wave. And at this time, remember, we still don't know how this war is going to turn out. The ending is not certain. And so they rush this movie into the movie theater just to ride the wave of American patriotism that's going on at the time. They're not following a release strategy of any kind. They're just surfing a news cycle, basically. So this film wins Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay. And the American Film Institute to this day ranks it as the second greatest American film ever made. So nobody involved with the production expected it to be anything out of the ordinary. It was really a propaganda war film. By their own words, just one of 100 pictures that were going to be produced by Hollywood every year. Nobody expected anything from it. They were making a movie, a product. And somewhere inside all of that chaos, a broken script, multiple writers on this script, a borrowed star, an over budget production, and the release timed to a military invasion, this art happened. And I want to sit with that for a second before we go anywhere else, because that story, that specific story, is actually what this episode is going to be about. So today I want to talk about how film has always been a business. And I want to talk specifically about money. And even more specifically, I want to talk about how money moves through a film, from a person who will be writing the first check through the system all the way to when it comes back and if it comes back. So I need to say something before we get there, because I think this will reframe everything. Because film has always been a business, by that I mean always, not sometimes, not just when it's convenient, but always. Jack Warner didn't buy Everybody Comes to Rick's because he was moved by the human condition. He bought it because his story editor said that it had some commercial potential, and he happened to trust her judgment. Hal Wallace didn't cast Humphrey Bogart because of pure artistic conviction that Bogart was best movie star of the time or best movie actor of the time. Bogart was a bankable name. Ingrid Bergman was borrowed from David Selznick's roster because Selznick negotiated a loan in a way that served his interests as well. Every single decision on this production, just so you understand, the cast, the writers, the schedule, the release date, was a business decision first, with artistic judgment just layered on top. Now, the result, of course, is one of the greatest films that has ever been made, whether it's on your top 10 or in your top 5 or it's on your list. Even if you're not necessarily someone who watches it over and over and over again, or thinks of it as a film that entertains them, you can't deny that it has lasted the test of time. And I say this because I think there's a persistent idea that serious art requires an indifference to some commerce. And that is, I think, one of the most damaging myths that we have in independent film, because it keeps talented filmmakers broke. It keeps investors suspicious, and it keeps good projects from getting off the ground. The old story that you're either a commercial filmmaker or an artistic one, that you either care about money or you care about the work, that story is over. And we shouldn't mourn it, because that was never the strategy to begin with. We interviewed Bruce last week, and even he was saying, my job is to make commercial films first, and art hopefully comes out of that. Hopefully we get a good movie out of that, or one that stands the test of time. What the Casablanca story actually shows us is that for an investor, for someone sitting across the table from us as filmmakers, as film producers, being asked to write a check, the question shouldn't be, is this a business or an art? The question has always been, is this a well-run business that understand it as art? And is there a structure in place that's going to protect my money or handle my money while the movie finds out how it's going to be successful? That structure has a name, then it's called a waterfall. So what is a waterfall? I want to explain this in a way that actually makes sense, because I've sat in rooms where people throw this term around like everybody already knows what it means. And I think for us filmmakers, half the time we don't, including myself early on. So here's a version that I wish someone had taught me when I was learning how to make films, learning how to produce films. Imagine your film makes money, any amount. Let's just say it plays in theaters. It gets a streaming deal. It sells to a broadcaster. Money starts coming in. And the question is, who's getting paid in what order before that money actually comes and reaches you as the filmmaker, or before it reaches the person who invested in your film? And that order, that sequence, is called a waterfall. Money flows through levels one at a time, and each level fills before the next one sees anything. So here's what makes it interesting, because it's not arbitrary. Every level in that waterfall has to represent some kind of a deal that someone made, a risk that someone took, or that an entity took, or a cost someone incurred. And understanding the waterfall is really just an understanding of whose deal came first and whose risk has been the greatest. So let me walk you through it. And I'm going to use a $2 million Canadian film as an example because that's a real number in the world that I have worked on. So let's take level one. Your film plays in theaters. Someone buys a ticket. Maybe a lot of people will buy some tickets. Maybe you play in a few theaters. Of every dollar that comes in through the ticket window, or when you buy a ticket online, roughly 50 cents is going to stay with the theater. So the exhibitor, that's what the theater is. That could be like Cineplex Odeon in Canada, Regal Cinemas in the States, so on and so forth. I think Cineplex is really the only real game in town in Canada, although we do have Landmark Cinemas out here in British Columbia, and I'm not sure if that's out east. Cineplex or whoever runs the chain is going to keep half of that money regardless. So for every dollar, 50 cents is going to Cineplex. And that's their business model. Oftentimes you can negotiate, of course, that, but especially most of the time from the deals that I've been involved in and the deals that I have heard of from other people, it's usually about 50 cents on the dollar. So that's Cineplex's business model. They pay their rent, they run their projectors, they sell the popcorn, and this 50 cents for every dollar is kind of what's going to pay for them to operate as a business. Our film is actually what's going to bring people in the door, but half of the ticket belongs to the theater before anyone else sees it. So right from the start, you've lost half of the dollar from that ticket sale. All right, so let's go to level two now, the distributor. So most of us in Canada, the way to get your movie into a movie theater is you're probably going to have to go through some kind of a distributor, a Canadian distributor, an American distributor, and so on, because they have the relationships with the theaters. I can't call up Cineplex tomorrow and book my movie in 10 theaters nationwide or even 100 theaters nationwide. I need to go through a distributor in order to do that. Cineplex doesn't like to take phone calls from hundreds and hundreds and thousands of filmmakers. They tend to want to take phone calls only from the people that they do business with on a regular basis because they negotiate their rate and their fee with that distributor alone. And usually that distributor is bringing a few films to them at the same time. So that distributor, though, is not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're taking a fee, and they're taking typically around, again, this is all negotiable, but typically about 20 to 35% of the net. And that's what remains after the theater cut. So 20 to 35% of the 50% that you've already lost to the theater. So on top of that fee, they're also recouping expenses because what they do in order to sell the film is they go to markets, they put some advertising in, they cut a trailer, they make posters, they do some digital advertising. So they pay for that advertising to get the movie known. They don't have to worry necessarily these days about prints, which is something that it used to be called P&A, so prints and advertising. There's not so much prints anymore. I mean, there are DCP copies and so on, but generally speaking, even nowadays, you can actually transmit the digital file even over the internet. So it's not as important for them to ship a hard drive to every single Cineplex or every single theater. So all of that is going to come off before anything is going to reach the production. All right, so you've lost half to the theater and you've lost about 30% of what remains to the distributor. And that's before anything has come through to the film at all. Now let's go to level 3 of this waterfall. So we've got the top level where the water's going, and then it flows over to the next part, which is the distributor. And then we're now going to the third part, which is what we call the debt financing. So if your film had any kind of a loan, gap financing is when you have someone who's loaned you the money to cover the difference between what you've been able to raise and the actual budget of the film. A bank loan against the tax credits, which is much more common, especially in Canada, is that you're going to have a bank loan. That's going to be money that the bank loaned you against the tax credits that we anticipate that you're going to be getting from the film, because you're not going to get those tax credits until you actually file your taxes. It's a whole thing. So your bank is a production lender, or whoever lent you that money, they're the ones who get it next. So debt always comes first. You're always paying off loans first. So if you owe any money to anybody, those are the first groups and entities that are going to get paid. That's not just a film industry rule. That's just basic logic of capital for any project that you're going with. The people who lent money, and they usually lend it at a fixed term, so it's not profit sharing, it's a fixed term that you might be paying interest on too. They get paid back before the people who invested for a share of the upside. So before your investors, the loaners get the money back, and they get it with interest. So the interest is something, again, that you've negotiated before the loan was approved, and you're paying that interest. And that's one of the reasons why debt goes first, is because the sooner you can pay off that loan, the lower your interest costs are going to be, the less interest you're paying. Now we filled that up. We've paid off all of our debts, and then we go to level 4, which is the equity. Now, finally, we reach to the equity investors. This is the private money. This is the people that you are all talking to, that we're all talking to, who we are asking to invest in our movie. This is private money. This is people who wrote checks based on our pitch deck and a belief in the project, or a belief in the people making the project, conversations over coffee and dinners and drinks about what this film could be. So if there's anything left at this point, that's where the investors are recouping. And if the film performs well enough beyond that, if there's genuine profit above the full recoupment, profit participation kicks in for the producers and for the key talent. To be really honest, most investors in most independent films never really see that profit stage, and so they're really just hoping to clear level 4, which is basically level 4 is getting made whole. They want to see their investment come back. That's really, really what, sort of the minimum goal you're aiming for is that you want to make sure that you've got it set up so that the film is set up so that it has the greatest potential for the investor to clear level 4, which is to recoup their full investment. And that's the honest version in this industry. So any producer who tells you differently is either naive or not being straight with you. Now, a sophisticated investor recognizes this structure immediately. It looks exactly like preferred equity waterfall in real estate. First-in lenders are getting priority. Common equity sits below. Profit participation is last. So the language is different, but the logic is identical. So your position in the hierarchy, it means everything. Now, because the film industry is we tend to, in order to make films, we set up single-purpose companies. We set up what they call single-purpose vehicles, film production companies that are designed just to make that particular movie. And all this money is flowing into the production at different points. Tax credits are coming in after a tax return is filed. Tax rebates sometimes are coming in sooner. And you're getting distributor money, you're getting distribution money, so from sales and so on. Everything's coming in at different points. It's easy for an investor to be a little bit wary about how and when their money is going to come in, and at what point are they able to actually verify what the money is. So here's why I want to take a quick detour, because there's a piece of infrastructure in this waterfall that we don't always talk about, especially when we're pitching or when we're getting things in place. But it tells you more about how serious the producer is than almost anything else. And it's called a CAMA, which is a collection account management agreement. And there are 2 companies in the world right now that I'm aware of that actually do this specifically for film productions, and especially independent film productions. And I want to explain what this is, but also what it's for, because those are 2 very different things. So a CAMA is a third-party administrator, a specialist company that sits between the distributor and everyone else in the waterfall. So once revenue is coming in from ticket sales, streaming deals, international sales, all of it, it flows directly into the CAMA account first. And then the administrator of that account then disperses it according to the agreed waterfall. So you make this waterfall, you have this agreed waterfall. That waterfall is delivered to the collection account management. They then are the ones who actually distribute the money. So nobody, not even the filmmaker, not the production company, not the director, not the writer, nobody, not the sales agent, can touch that money before the waterfall runs. It's an external documented process, and it removes any kind of human discretion from anything. Now, here's what it's for, and this is the part that would matter to an investor. The reason that a CAMA exists is because film revenue historically has been really easy to lose. Not necessarily through fraud, although that's definitely something that happens. I mean, it happens in lots of businesses, but it does happen in the film industry as well. But it also can be easy to lose through a much more common problem. The distributor collects the revenue, has expenses, has other films, has cash flow pressures on their own. And that money that should be flowing back to the production can be slow. It can be murky and it can be hard to verify. And the accounting can get complicated. And there's a reason why we sometimes refer to this as Hollywood accounting, because Hollywood accounting can make things look a little bit different than what you actually are seeing with your own eyes. And I'm not putting this all on distributors, but one of the reasons why this is important is because for distributors, expenses, they're the ones claiming expenses on the film before they're dispersing money. So these expenses can be claimed in ways that are difficult to audit. It's very hard to audit travel, for example, for a distributor, film market, for example, where they're selling 10 films. How do you assess how much of the money that they spent on that trip was directly related to your film, as an example? So that's why a CAMA makes all of this visible. It puts a neutral referee in the middle of the transaction. The distributor pays into the account. The administrator runs the waterfall, and everyone, including the investors, the production company, Telefilm, if they're involved, and so on, even banks and so on, get a clear accounting of what came in and where it went. So here's why this connects directly to the dependency problem I talked about earlier. A CAMA is what makes the waterfall real rather than theoretical. Without it, the waterfall becomes a document. With it, the waterfall is a system. And that's the thing. In the Canadian system, with Telefilm's involvement or whatever, a CAMA is standard practice. It's expected. And in fact, Telefilm actually specifies that CAMA fees, typically around 1% of the gross receipts, are an acceptable cost of the deal structure. So what this means for Canadian film finance with public money is that the waterfall infrastructure is built into the deal from the beginning. So this is something that if you're a filmmaker, you want to be thinking about this right from the beginning. How is the waterfall structured? Because if you're going to ask someone for money, you need to know when they're going to ask, when does my money come back? And you want to be able to provide not just who's in front of them, but also what the realistic timelines are going to be. And you don't want the investor to have to rely on just your goodwill or the distributor's honesty, because again, that is a risk. Now, I'm not saying you're not trustworthy. I'm not saying I'm not trustworthy, but it's a risk. So this is why we have a third party who runs those disbursements. Okay, and here's where this dependency problem comes back in. Even with the CAMA in place, the waterfall only matters if there's revenue flowing through it. So there has to be water in the waterfall. A perfectly structured CAMA on a film that nobody watches is a very organized way of distributing nothing. So all of these things protect the structure, but the filmmaker still has to fill it. This is not the glamorous world of filmmaking here. This is the infrastructure. For an investor, the presence of this CAMA is a significant signal that says that the producer has set this up like a business. They've anticipated revenue, they've structured a payback mechanism, and they've put in a neutral third party to make sure that it's all run correctly. So if a producer can't explain their waterfall clearly, that could be a yellow flag to an investor. And if there's no third-party structure in place like a CAMA, that could also be a red flag. Okay, so that's the waterfall. And that's also an American model as much as it is a Canadian model. But the American model is a structure that's been taught in film schools, and it's been written up in trade publications for the better part of a century. But here's where it gets interesting, because in Canada, the waterfall has a bit of a different shape, and that shape changes everything about the investor's position. And so the math changes at the border. And let me paint a picture for you. In the American model, the classic independent film structure, private equity investors are often carrying between about 80 and 100% of the film's budget. So they are funding the entire film budget out of their pocket. They're at the bottom of a very long and expensive waterfall. So the theater is still taking half, the distributor is still taking their piece, the debt is still getting serviced, and the equity, the private money, your money, is waiting sometimes until all the sales happen. And that's a risk structure that most people imagine when they think about investing in film. They think that they're going to have to pay for it, like if it's a $2 million film, that the film needs $2 million. And that's why the reputation of a film investment being risky exists, because in that model, the math is genuinely hard. It's hard for a movie to make money. So what does it look like in Canada? In Canada, the waterfall has a bit of a different shape, and that shape is systematically, structurally, and by design designed to protect the private investor in a way that the American model doesn't. Canada has one of the most sophisticated public film funding infrastructures in the world, and most people outside of the industry don't really know this. Most people inside the industry don't even really know this. And the ones who do take it for granted without fully understanding what it actually does to an investor's risk exposure. So let me break this down in as non-technical a way as I can, because the point isn't in the policy details, and the point is what it means for the structure of the deal. So the first thing is that you're looking for some kind of a Canadian distribution arm to take the film, because a lot of the times the Canadian distribution arm is actually a trigger for a lot of these other public things. We have a fund in Canada called the Canadian Media Fund, which is actually providing funding for much Canadian content. It is not a loan. It does not sit on the waterfall as debt, and it reduces the total private equity requirement before the raise even begins. So it's committed capital that shrinks the gap before you ask a private investor to fill it. And this is important because, again, take that $2 million film and imagine that the CMF can come in for a small portion of that film. So now you're reducing the cost of making the film. The CMF does require a broadcaster agreement, so you have to be looking for that broadcaster agreement in order to trigger the CMF. And I'm not going to get into that. I'll probably have someone on to talk about how that works on a later episode. So the second layer, of course, for Canada is that we have federal tax credits through CAVCO, which is the Canadian Audiovisual Certification Office. Now, federal tax credits can apply to both Canadian projects and non-Canadian originated projects, like American projects that happen to film here. But to qualify for sort of the Canadian content CAVCO certification, there needs to be the key creatives essentially need to be all Canadian. At least one of the main actors has to be Canadian, and so on. And there's a point system that qualifies you. And a production that qualifies receives a significant percentage of its Canadian labor cost back as a refundable tax credit. So essentially, as long as you're hiring Canadian workers, you're able to get a tax credit back. And this is a refundable tax credit, meaning that even if the film loses money, the tax credit still pays out. So the revenue side can be disappointing even, but the credit was still going to happen. So the credit is guaranteed, and it's secured, and it's something that banks will lend off of. I mean, banks don't give money away; they lend money based on securable assets, and the tax credit is a securable asset that they can bank on. And so that's something that happens even if your film is not a box office success. Now, again, in order to qualify for CAVCO, there are certain things you have to go through. You have to make sure that your residency documents are up to date with all of your key crew, and all of your crew, in fact, that you're wanting to claim credits off of. One of the things that you do want to make sure when you're hiring crew, and it's a question that people don't ask, and I certainly have been guilty of this too, is when you are asking anybody who you intend to claim Canadian tax credits off of, is ask them if they have filed their last year's taxes. Because if they haven't filed their last year's taxes by the time they start to work on your production, they need to file their last year's taxes before the end of the production. And you and I both know that if they're working on a production, they probably are not going to be spending their time doing their taxes. So one of your hiring requirements for crew should be that you ask them if they have filed their tax return for the previous year. And if they run what's called a corporate loan out, which is if they basically have a single company that they run all their business and all their payments through, that company has also filed its tax returns for the current year or the previous year that you're in. It's actually very important, because what you're doing when you're getting your tax credits is you are getting an audit of the labor costs that are going to happen. This is for Canadian tax credits because they're labor-based, and BC tax credits because they're labor-based. They're checking residency, and residency is checked by tax returns. And it kind of makes sense because you're getting a tax refund based on labor who is going to be paying tax on the money that you are paying them. So, or income tax on the money that you're paying them. So it kind of makes sense from a logical standpoint, but it is something that many of us get burned on as producers because we don't ask that question before we hire someone. And then when they don't have their tax return filed, if the tax return isn't filed by the time we apply for our tax credits, we can potentially lose that person's labor from our tax credit. In other words, it can be disqualified. So just something to keep in mind. So the third layer of this, of course, and I just mentioned, is the provincial incentives that are on top of that. So in British Columbia, where I'm based, we have the BC Provincial Services Tax Credit and we have the BC Film Incentive Tax Credit. The Production Services Tax Credit is for productions that are not BC creatively controlled, are not Canadian. Usually these are like the Hollywood movies that come up here. And the BC Film Incentive Tax Credit is for BC-based businesses making films. And these stack on top of the federal tax credit. So you get a federal tax credit, you get a provincial tax credit, and you also get your CMF contribution, which kind of reduces your tax credits, but it reduces your overall budget volume. Anyway, it stacks. Now, some of the provinces in British Columbia or some of the provinces in Canada are tax rebates or are all spend rebates. So Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, all have these all spend credits. So as long as when you spend the money in the province, you get the money back. So it's not labor based as long as you're spending it with companies and organizations and people in that province. So it's labor based in that you have to spend it on labor that resides in that province. So similar to the labor-based tax credit in British Columbia, you spend $1,000 on a crew member for a day, you're getting the tax rebate on the expense that you spent on them as long as they are residing in the province of the tax rebate. But also this applies also to hotels you might be staying in or to rentals, anything you're renting, anything you're buying, as long as it's bought within that province, it's a rebate. So that kind of is that third layer of provincial incentives. And there's people who do calculations on this and people who get paid money to do that. So I'm not going to get into the weeds on that here. So then kind of, I guess, on the third plus layer, if you want to call it that, if there's an international co-production and it's part of a co-production treaty that's structured correctly, Canada has bilateral co-production treaties with more than like 50 countries, which means that a Canadian producer can access the federal and provincial tax credits as well as potentially access public funding from other jurisdictions, other countries simultaneously, depending on the partners involved and depending on the percentage of ownership of this co-production. And again, that's a whole other weeds. I'd probably get another podcast to deliver that. So what this all actually means in practice, and this is kind of the number to hold on to, is that you can structure a $2 million Canadian film that may only require about $600,000 to $700,000 in private equity, and the rest will be covered by the public stack before a single private investor has even asked for a dollar. So you run that against the American model with the same budget. With an American film, private investors are going to fund like 80 to 100%, and the rest is going to be covered by like minimum guarantees and distribution, maybe pre-sales. But in Canadian film, the private investor is funding 30 to 40% of the film. Obviously, if you don't have the telefilm money and you don't have this co-production and so on, it could be up to like 60% of the budget, but it's definitely not 80 to 100. This is the same film with a dramatically different risk exposure. And one of the interesting things with Canada versus the US, and I know BC and Canada versus the US models, is that even though the US, some states have tax credits, they have caps on some of their tax credits. First of all, which means that their money does run out each year. Like it's in their budget. They can only pay so much out. So you have to qualify and you have to get in before the money is out in each state. And the other thing too is sometimes they have floors and ceilings about how much your film budget has to be. In other words, if you wanted to make like a low budget $300,000 to $500,000 film, you might not qualify for the tax credits in certain states. Whereas in Canada and British Columbia, especially, you can qualify for those tax credits. The budget for the film doesn't matter. Now, if your feature film is $50,000 or even less, it might not make sense because the cost just to audit this and to put this all together that might just not make it worth it. But anything really around $150,000 to $200,000 or up is worth looking at the tax credits for. And one place you can go for resources on these waterfalls and how this private investor stuff works is, again, we interviewed him last year, Darren Smith at Craftsman Films. He's a Utah-based producer, and I would really encourage you to read his content. He writes extensively on the principle that smart producers should target about 40 to 50% in equity financing but you need to package that with lots of distribution deals. So what he talks about is that the best structures are built on layered capital and just not on pure equity. And what I want you to understand is that in Canada, that's not just aspirational, that's the baseline. The infrastructure makes this the default. Now, I want to be honest here. The Canadian system doesn't guarantee returns. It doesn't manufacture upside. A badly made film is a badly made film in any country for that matter. So it doesn't matter what funding structure you have. Bad film is a bad film. The tax credits are going to flow whether the movie is good or bad. The CMF contribution doesn't know if your script is brilliant or mediocre. And telefilm has an adjudication process for whether or not they're going to give you money. So you might not get money if the film doesn't meet certain jury requirements. But ultimately, in the end, this public stacking reduces the downside. It doesn't create upside, though. The upside is still our job, the filmmaker's job, the story, the commercial thinking, the distribution plan, and whether or not the film will find an audience. So in Canadian film, the government takes the first loss. The private investor takes a protected position. And so that means that, a $2 million film is really only costing us $1 million, which means that we're in profitability once the movie is making enough money to cover the investor portion of the budget. So instead of, on a $2 million movie that is fully funded by private equity, you might need to make $6 to $10 million before the movie is actually profitable. Whereas on a $2 million movie in Canada, you probably only need to make $3 to $5 million before you're in profit. Because again, as we were talking about with theaters and with distribution percentages and so on, how that money gets whittled down. So this brings us back to Casablanca, because that film history of the movie is a precise illustration of something that's always been true about this industry since the beginning. So Jack Warner buying Everyone Comes to Rick's for $20,000, he had a studio, he had distribution, he had contracted talent, he had an entire infrastructure that would absorb the overhead that would otherwise fall, for us as independent filmmakers, that would fall on a single production budget. But for Warner Brothers, that made the risk of that acquisition manageable. And in Canada, public funding system is that same infrastructure, but it's for independent film. So we have to think about ourselves as that public infrastructure is like Warner Brothers, basically, for us. And so for our independent film, it doesn't come with that idea of like the Warner Brothers logo authority or a Burbank backlot or something like that, but it comes with something just as real, which is committed capital that reduces private investor exposure before we even go into production. So what's the catch? What's the crutch here? So the system is good, right? So in 2025, so last year, the total Canadian box office was $836.9 million. And so that's every film, every ticket, every cinema across the country. Purely Canadian movies earned 13.9 million of that. Not 13.9%, $13.9 million. So out of 836 million, 13.9 million was spent on Canadian films. So that's roughly 1.6% of the total box office in our own country. Think about that for a sec. All right. In 2025, only 3 Canadian films crossed the $1 million mark at the Canadian box office. 3 out of 240 Canadian films that screened theatrically that year. So 237 films funded, produced, certified, completed, and they all earned less than $1 million in Canadian theaters. Now, before going further on that, I just want to clarify something. The majority of those films weren't chasing theatrical runs in the way that a commercial feature would. And you guys know what commercial features chasing money look like. I mean, you'll see ads on them. You'll see billboards. You'll see promotional material online, things like that. Now, some of these are documentaries, and some of these are festival films, and some of these were intentionally limited releases. In other words, they were meant to go straight to streaming or straight to transactional video on demand. And thus the theatrical window, it wasn't intended as the primary revenue stream. And, it's easy to, if you work in the film industry, or if you've done any productions in Canada or in the film industry, that like theatrical runs they're harder push up because they do require a lot more of an investment into getting butts in seats. So I know that, that as well. If I'm being honest about what the number reveals is that there's a structural issue in Canadian film that we're not addressing. Because it connects directly to this waterfall, and it connects directly to what an investor needs to understand before they write a check. So Let me tell you what I think is actually going on, because I think the public funding system, which is genuinely world class, and I generally mean that, it has a blind spot. And that blind spot is that it was designed to fund completion, not performance. Think about how the system works. We have Telefilm Canada, which I haven't even talked about, the Canadian Media Fund. We have provincial tax credits. We have federal tax credits and rebates and all these other entities coming in to publicly fund the film. What do they all have in common? They are all triggered with production. The tax credits flow when you spend the money on Canadian certified labor, on qualified production activity. Telefilm provides either grants or equity investment going in, which is before the cameras even roll. The CMF requires a broadcast trigger, a licensing fee commitment, but that commitment is made before the film is finished based on an application, not an audience response. So, in other words, the public money rewards you for making the film, not for anyone watching it. Most grants reward completion, not performance. So once the film is finished, the funding agency's basically formal control ends. There's no structural requirement to prove that Canadians actually watched the movie. A researcher writing in a CRTC study put it this way: the government agencies that fund Canadian film have historically treated cultural representation as a higher priority than commercial performance. The imperatives of showing Canadian stories, representing Canadian communities, and maintaining Canadian cultural sovereignty, those have always outweighed the question of whether the film finds its audience. And I'm not saying that that is wrong. I think Canadian cultural identity matters. I think publicly funded film serves a purpose, and that a pure market logic can't or doesn't. But here's the problem: when the system forgives commercial failure, when 60% of your budget is guaranteed regardless of whether anyone buys a ticket, you can start to treat profitability as more of a nice to have than the essential part of a business model. And that is a very slow, very comfortable way to build a film industry that nobody watches. So we take the Casablanca contrast. Jack Warner doesn't have a tax credit. There's no government agency that guaranteed a percentage of his labor costs back, regardless of whether Casablanca found an audience. There was no completion fund. There was no cultural mandate that said this film represents American identity, patriotism, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, it deserves to exist whether or not people see it. So every dollar that Warner Brothers was spending on that film was at risk. Every dollar, even the $20,000 for the rights, the $1 million production budget, the distribution costs, the print costs for the film prints, all of that was exposed to market performance. And because of that exposure, because failure was genuinely possible, every decision on that film was heightened or sharpened by commercial instinct. The casting, script decisions, release timing, the decision even to rush it into one New York theater. The moment the Allies took Casablanca, that was a producer looking at the market and moving, not waiting for a cultural mandate to protect him. So what I'm saying from all of this is that risk actually has a function. It makes our judgment sharper. When the system removes enough risk that the filmmaker doesn't have to think commercially, something gets lost. And I'm not saying that the art gets lost, but the discipline behind the art gets lost. The great paradox of the Canadian system is that it was built to protect Canadian film from commercial pressure. And it actually has been very successful that way. Canadian filmmakers have enormous creative freedom compared to almost any other market in the world, provided you can get that funding. Like Telefilm is a prime example of that, and we've talked about that, is that what do they actually want to fund can determine whether or not you actually get your movie made if you're relying on that system. But ultimately, in the end, this system genuinely works as it's designed to work. But my argument here is that creative freedom without commercial accountability can drift into making films for basically just yourself, your friends, and your family. And a film that is just made for yourself is not an investment. It's actually an expense. It's a hobby. Now, here's where this connects directly to the waterfall, because the investor is the one that we're all fighting to get. And they're the ones sitting at the bottom of this equation, and they need to understand exactly what the system's forgiveness will mean for their position. So remember how I described the Canadian waterfall. The public funding stack covers about 35 to 60% of a typical budget. The private investor comes in for 30 to 40%, or maybe up to 50%. And then the ultimate end of this is that the government is always taking the first loss, and the private investor is protected from that first loss. And that's all true. And it's genuinely better, I think, than the American model. But The tax credits and the public funding reduce the equity gap, but they don't create revenue. They sit on the cost side of the ledger. The revenue side, the income, what actually flows back through the waterfall, that still depends entirely on the film finding an audience. And if the film earns nothing theatrically, the waterfall is nearly empty before the private investor sees a dollar. So we're now relying on those streaming platforms and so on to have that water start flowing. The tax credits have already been collected by the production company during the production cycle. They're not waiting in the waterfall for you. They're gone. They paid for the film to get made. So the investor's actual return depends not on the funding structure, but on the revenue performance. And in a market where Canadian films earn 1.6% of their own domestic box office, that performance question can't just be an afterthought. The public stack protects our downside on the budget. It does nothing for our upside on the revenue. And those are two completely different problems. Our system solves the first problem, and the filmmaker is left to solve the second. So what do we need to do? Let me give you some real numbers, and these are not projections. These are what actually exists in the market right now. As we've said, the total Canadian box office in a normal year runs between about 835 million and 900 million. Canadian films historically earn between 14 and 30 million of that, depending on this year or whether there's a breakout film. In 2023, a strong year, which was considered a strong year, the number was 29 million. And in 2025, it dropped to 13.9 million. So for a $2 million Canadian film to return its budget at the theatrical box office alone, it would need to earn roughly $6 to $8 million in revenue, counting for the theater cut, the distributor, the marketing expenses, running through the waterfall before the production company sees anything. So $6 to $8 million in Canadian theatrical revenue is what would be needed for a Canadian film to be what we would consider a box office success before it hits the streaming services. But as we know, we talked with Bruce about this last week, a theatrical run creates the value for the digital release. Digital release dollars can be predicated on how successful your theatrical run was, as long as you're making those deals in succession. The value of your film will go up if you have a successful theatrical run. And I'm not saying that you need to make your money back in a theatrical run. I mean, that's a hard thing to do. We are a country of only 40 million people. So a purely Canadian film's main audience is going to be in Canada. It's going to be very difficult to have a $6 million box office, because a $6 million box office requires about 600,000 to 1 million people to go and see your movie. And as we said, that's about let's just say 500,000 on the low end of 48,000. That means anyway, the percentage is not big, or it's fairly large size of the population of Canada need to see your film. You need about 500,000 people in Canada seeing your film. And if your film is Canadian film, what are its chances of finding an American theatrical run where people, aside from people you already know, are going to go and see it? And there just aren't 1,000 movie theaters in Canada either. So you've got to think to yourself that you're looking at only a handful of movie theaters in Canada, and you've got to fill them up, or at least you've got to put enough people in there to keep that run going. This is just something to keep in mind as you're working out your theatrical plan. If you're trying to make a movie that has potential to have audiences come see it, you've got to be thinking about this ahead of time. And this is not a reason to stop making films. It is a reason to stop pretending that theatrical is the only business model. And so here's where a smart Canadian film strategy actually looks like. And this is the version that will work for the waterfall, for the investor, not just for laurels at a film festival. And what we do is we look at theatrical in Canada as not the revenue engine, but as the marketing campaign. So even a modest Canadian theatrical release does several things that have nothing to do with ticket sales. It creates critical press and review coverage, obviously, that our streaming platforms and foreign buyers are going to use to evaluate the acquisition value. It will establish the film as a cultural event and not just content. It will generate a verified audience that subscription VOD platforms will need before they're maybe willing to offer meaningful licensing fees. Now, you might already have some of these worked out, but your theatrical will help you with your foreign sales and with your non-domestic sales, because your theatrical will be basically the proof of concept. It's going to show other people that there is money in this film. So A well-structured Canadian film in 2026 has to think of its revenue in layers. So your broadcaster license fees, Canadian Broadcasters Agreement is often the trigger for CMF funding, as I said before. So that relationship needs to start early and create that guaranteed revenue floor. And then the SVOD licensing, the streaming deals for the Canadian and the international rights through a sales agent at markets and so on, and VOD and digital windows come after the theatrical run closes. The waterfall that works for an investor is the waterfall that has these multiple revenue streams feeding it and not just the theatrical. And while I'm being honest, let me talk about minimum guarantees here, because this is where a lot of the first time investors get a bit of a distorted picture. We're all asked to get minimum guarantees, which is like it's an upfront payment system from a distributor against future revenue. So in this classic model, you would pre-sell a territory at a market, receive an MG on delivery, and use that committed agreement as collateral for a bank loan or for gap financing during production. Now, in the DVD era, MGs were substantial. A horror film with C-list cast could pull a few million in MGs just on format rights. Now, that world doesn't exist anymore because we don't have really DVDs anymore. Streaming collapsed that, and the MG market for independent films without bankable cast or any festival pedigree is dramatically compressed. So a realistic Canadian distributor, MG on, say, a $2 million film might at most be $100,000, maybe $200,000 if it's got something with it. And that's not nothing. That's a real number because you've got to, again, don't discount it. That's going to help. But it's not a revenue engine. It's one input into the waterfall that needs to be built from multiple inputs. And critically, if you're an investor, this number tells you whether a producer has done the work. A producer with a signed MG and a broadcast license, and maybe even an SVOD letter of intent, is doing the work. And a producer with a finished script and just a dream hasn't. So let's bring all of this back to the core question, because what I think is a genuinely well-structured Canadian film investment looks like is a version where the system's strengths are real and the system's weaknesses have been addressed by the filmmaker before they walk in the door. The public funding stack reduces our private equity. That part I described earlier, and that's obviously reliable and bankable. The tax credits are stable, and they're not just hopes and theoreticals, and they don't have a cap, and they've been running for decades, and they're close to guaranteed as anything in this industry. So that's not the gamble. They are there, and they're probably the strongest of any G7 country, and I don't know if they may even be the strongest in the world. But on the revenue side of the waterfall, what flows after the film is made, that depends on the decisions that we make as filmmakers before we even go to production. So this is a distribution strategy that we have to work on. Casting decisions that are going to create some kind of international sales value. A theatrical release that is designed to build momentum and not just to justify a theatrical release. And in fact, Telefilm has that distribution requirement, is that a funded film must be theatrically released in Canada within 1 year of delivery. So aside from it just being a requirement, they're creating a very low bar because that's one theatrical release in the film's primary language market. And that's all that the system is requiring of you in order to be eligible for the Telefilm funding. So we should be treating this as producers as a floor and not the ceiling. The theatrical release should be designed to basically generate the coverage and momentum that feeds every other subsequent revenue window. And I'm finding more and more how much of this is sort of hodgepodge and thrown together at the last minute. But when a filmmaker has done all of that, so when we're thinking commercially and building that into the project from the development side of things and not just bolting it at the end, the Canadian waterfall can be genuinely very powerful. The public stack will help cover the downside, and the revenue strategy that we build in development creates the upside that flows back to the investor, and that structure will hold. And when we don't do that, when the commercial thinking is a nice to have rather than the point, then the waterfall is structurally there, but it's practically empty. There just isn't that money flowing through. And in this case, like, the investor wins only if we're thinking commercially from the beginning. So the system protects us as filmmakers on the way in, and our commercial discipline is what gets us out on the other side. And one of our biggest issues with film investors is we're constantly having to reinvent the wheel, right? Like, we're constantly having to re-engage people and explain how film investing works, because very few of us are actually approaching our films in a logical commercial way in order to make film investing still a risky proposition, but not as risky a proposition, to make it seem more of a, you're betting on something by believing in the people and believing in the story and believing in the concept. It is a greater likelihood that your belief will be rewarded. And that's what we're going for, right? All right, let's close this off. I think I've gone on long enough. So let's zoom out a second, because it's important to say this. So everything I've talked about today, the waterfall, the public funding stack, the multi-window revenue strategy, none of this is theoretical. I'm building this with Quiet Canadians right now and a couple of other projects that I'm working with. But Quiet Canadians is kind of like the baby project that we've been working on for the last couple of years. I'm not the only person doing it this way, because obviously my co-host Ken just wrapped production on Remnant, and he has done a very similar way in terms of how Remnant was financed. It's got the private equity combined with the tax credits. And so it's got the very similar structural thinking. There's a public stack plus private equity, and put together with a marketing plan and so on before they went to production. So there are filmmakers across the country that are doing this exactly right now. So we're building the structure first. We're treating the financing as seriously as the story and the script, spending probably more time on the financing and the marketing and the distribution strategy than we are on on the script. And understanding that the waterfall isn't something that we figure out how to fund it. Like, we know we can create the structure of the waterfall ahead of time, and that's easy, but figure out how to fund the waterfall, how to flow money into it after the film is finished is not something you figure out. You have to figure this out and design it before we even get started. So that's what I think a new generation of Canadian filmmakers is going to have to look like. We can't wait necessarily for this archaic system to deliver for us. We have to use the system and build commercial discipline on top of that. And here's the thing about timing, because if we come back to Casablanca one more time, it's important to think about how your film fits into the current landscape of what the world is looking for and what the world is experiencing. There are a lot of issues going on in the world right now, and it's important to sometimes think about, like, how is the project that you're working on going to fit within the zeitgeist of what is currently happening. So, like, Quiet Canadians, really good example. I mean, not to plug, but it's a very good example where, we've got this current cycle of how the world order is being rewritten in front of us, and starting to define what Canada's role in that world is going to be, and that new world order is, and what kind of a leadership role are we taking in this. So, a movie like ours, but also movies that speak to Canadian cultural identity and speak to, the Canadian experience, the experience of the people who live here in a unique and commercially viable way, may have more opportunities to break through than it might have, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So this is kind of an opportunity in Canada. And again, going back to Casablanca, nobody really planned on the Allied invasion of North Africa. Warner Brothers didn't plan on that. Nobody sat in a story meeting and said, let's make a film called Casablanca, and then let's time it to a major military operation in the city of Casablanca. That didn't happen. And if it did, then everything is a conspiracy. This happened. The invasion happened. The film happened. It was ready. And Warner Brothers had the instinct and the infrastructure and the ability to move very quickly, to move immediately. So they got it into a theater in New York on Thanksgiving weekend within weeks of the invasion, before the news cycle could move on. The timing wasn't planned, but the readiness was. And so we're in a moment right now where Canadian identity and what it means to be Canadian, what we stand for when the pressure is on, and those questions are more alive now than they've been in a generation. And of course, we've got political speeches, Mark Carney's speech at Davos, and some of the conversations that we had at TIFF, and some of the conversations that were had at the CMPA conference this past year. There's a real reason people across the country are buying Canadian, traveling Canadian, and thinking about what but being Canadian actually means. And so films about Canadians are resonating more and creating a good background in terms of what the world events are. So the timing is actually quite good now for Canadian films, I think. Films like Remnant, Quiet Canadians, to speak to Ken and my projects, other Canadian films, genre films, entertaining films not as, like I said, these are not blockbuster films. They're films built on commercial instinct, though, and they're going to hit at particular moments. Horror is cyclical, and horror is great. If you make a good horror movie and you do it in an interesting way, it has a way of resonating. Audiences want to feel something, and the appetite for homegrown stories that actually deliver on their genre promises could be real. And you can't manufacture that right moment, but you can build a film that's ready for when the moment arrives. And that's, I think, the whole job. Casablanca was ready, not because it was perfect, and we've established that it was a chaotic production, but because the infrastructure was there, the distribution was there, the movie was made in such a way that it could capitalize on the zeitgeist of the moment. And the studio had the mechanism to move when the moment came. So for us, the waterfall, the public funding stack, the distribution strategy, that's our infrastructure. That's what being ready looks like for an independent film. Not a guarantee of success, but a guarantee that when the moment comes, we can move. So anyway, just to encapsulate the reason for this episode today, nobody can promise you that a film will find its audience. None of us can promise that. Jack Warner couldn't promise that. Darren Smith can't promise that. Ken can't promise that. I can't promise that. What we can do, though, and what us as independent producers should do and are doing, is build a structure that doesn't require the film to be a hit in order for the investor to have a coherent experience. So the tax credits are the public stack. The waterfall is set up to do its job, and we are systematizing how the money it flows. And it means that the financial architecture of the film is sound, independent of whether or not the film is successful or not. We build the structure so that a realistic result, it doesn't have to be a $60 million hit. It doesn't have to be a $100 million hit, but a realistic result, a $6 to $8 million result in theatrical, streaming, foreign sales, and so on, produces a real return for the people who believe in it. And then it becomes up to us, the creative work, the story, the execution, the timing, the audience. That's the part that we get to work on if we've got this part figured out. We get to work on making a good film. And the good film part is the part that will make all of this very interesting. And so that's, I guess, what I'm trying to lay out today. So this is not a formula for a hit, but this is just a framework for doing this seriously. Whether you're an independent producer trying to build something real, or you're looking at, as an investor or as a stakeholder, trying to understand what this looks like before you make that kind of a decision of whether or not you're going to put your money into something like this. But just to understand that film has always been a business, and it's always been a business that looked to create profitability for the people who put money into it. I mean, that's why there are bankers involved in film. That's why there are hedge funds. That's why there are capital lending entities for film, because they understand that there is a business aspect to the film industry. So these waterfalls, these structures have always existed. It's just important for us as the independent film producers that, as much as we just want to focus on the creativity side of things, to understand that the structure is actually what allows us to do everything that we do. So with that in mind, thanks again for being here, and I will be back next week, and we will dive into some more aspects of independent filmmaking. Feel free to ask any questions, send any thoughts you have, any comments to Off the Lot. You can find the links and the email addresses in the show notes, and let us know if there's a topic you'd like us to cover going forward.
Okay, so that's it for this week's episode of Off the Lot. We want to hear from you. If there are any topics you want covered or any questions you'd like answered, please email us at podcast.offthelot@gmail.com.
You can also find us on Instagram and YouTube. Our handles are in the show notes. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And share this with your friends. See you next week.